The American pilot ran his hand along the Spitfire's wing and laughed. Not a kind laugh, the dismissive kind. The kind that says you've already made up your mind and nothing's going to change it. You expect me to fly that? It was the summer of 1942, RAF Biggin Hill, just outside London. Lieutenant Mark Lambert of the United States Army Air Forces stood on the tarmac, staring at the aircraft the British kept insisting was the finest fighter in the world. All he saw was a death trap with pretty wings. The Submarine Spitfire sat gleaming in the morning light, its elliptical wings sweeping back in graceful curves that looked more like art than engineering. Lambert's crew chief, a grizzled mechanic from Detroit who'd worked on P-40s and P-39s back home, stood beside him, shaking his head. "Those wings are thin as paper," the chief muttered. "One good dive and they're gonna fold like a cheap suit." Lambert nodded. The Spitfire looked delicate, fragile even. Compared to the American fighters he'd trained on solid, muscular aircraft with thick, straight wings built to take punishment, the Spitfire seemed almost feminine, elegant but weak. He didn't trust elegant. He trusted sturdy, reliable, American. What Lambert didn't know, standing there in the summer sun with his arms crossed and his mind made up, was that within a week that fragile little British fighter would save his life 3 times and make him look like a fool for ever doubting it. The skepticism wasn't unique to Lambert. When the first American pilots started rotating through RAF squadrons in 1941 and early 1942 before the U.S. officially entered the war, some flying as volunteers, others as part of unofficial exchanges, they arrived with a particular brand of confidence. American confidence. They'd grown up on stories of American ingenuity, American muscle, American engineering that didn't need to be pretty because it was built to last. The fighters they'd trained on reflected that philosophy. The P-40 Warhawk was a brute, heavy tough, capable of taking hits and dishing them out. The P-39 Airacobra was unconventional but solid. Then they saw the Spitfire. It looked like something designed by an artist, not an engineer. The wings didn't just taper, they curved in these flowing elliptical shapes that seemed structurally impossible. The whole aircraft had this refined, almost delicate aesthetic. It was beautiful, and beauty to these American pilots was a liability. "It's a rich man's toy," one pilot from Texas said. "Something you fly to impress the ladies, not fight a war." The British instructors smiled politely and said nothing. They'd heard it before. Reginald Mitchell never lived to see the skeptics proven wrong. He died in 1937 cancer, taking him at just 42 years old, 3 years before the Spitfire would prove itself in the Battle of Britain. But before he died, Mitchell designed something that shouldn't have worked. Those elliptical wings weren't just for show. They were the result of brutal, obsessive engineering. Mitchell and his team at Submarine had spent years calculating lift distribution drag coefficients, structural stress tolerances. The elliptical shape wasn't decorative, it was optimal. It produced the most lift with the least drag while maintaining structural integrity across the entire span. But making it work required precision manufacturing that pushed 1930s technology to its limits. Each wing was built around a single main spar, a structural beam running from root to tip that was immensely strong despite its slim profile. The skin was flush riveted, creating a smooth surface that reduced drag. The internal structure was a network of ribs and stringers engineered to distribute stress evenly. It was complex, expensive, time-consuming to build, and it was brilliant. But the American pilots didn't know any of that. They just saw thin wings and assumed fragility. Lambert's first flight in a Spitfire Mark V was scheduled for a clear Tuesday morning. He walked around the aircraft 3 times before climbing in, still looking for something to justify his unease. The British ground crew watched with barely concealed amusement. One of them, a young corporal with grease-stained hands, finally spoke up. "She won't bite, sir." Lambert shot him a look. "How many of these have you seen come back with the wings folded?" "None, sir." "None?" "Not once. Seen a few come back with holes you could climb through wings half shot away, but I've never seen one fold. Not in a dive, not in a turn, not ever." Lambert wanted to believe him, wanted to. But skepticism is a hard habit to break. He climbed into the cockpit. The first thing he noticed was how tight it was. American fighters had room to move. The Spitfire's cockpit wrapped around you like a glove. The second thing he noticed was the smell oil and canvas, and something distinctly British. Tea, maybe. He wouldn't have been surprised. The ground crew walked him through the startup procedure. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed. Once, then roared to life with a sound that was deeper, smoother than anything Lambert had heard from an American radial engine. It was almost musical. He taxied to the runway, hands light on the stick, feeling the aircraft's weight and balance, or lack of weight. The Spitfire felt responsive. Too responsive, maybe. Every tiny input translated immediately to movement. Lambert pushed the throttle forward. And the Spitfire didn't just take off, it leaped. The climb rate was obscene. Lambert had barely rotated off the runway before the Spitfire was at 1,000 feet and still climbing like it was late for an appointment. The American fighters he'd flown, good aircraft, solid aircraft, climbed steadily, reliably. The Spitfire climbed like it was trying to escape gravity altogether. He leveled off at 5,000 feet and tried a few basic maneuvers. A gentle turn to the left. The Spitfire rolled into it so smoothly, Lambert thought for a second he'd barely moved the stick. He checked. No, he'd barely moved the stick. The aircraft was just that responsive. He tried a tighter turn. The Spitfire carved through the air like it was on rails. No wallowing, no mushiness, just clean, precise movement. Then he did something American pilots always did when testing a new fighter. He pushed the nose down and dove. This was the test, the moment of truth. This was where those thin, pretty wings would show their weakness. He watched the airspeed indicator climb. 200 knots. 250. 300. He waited for the flutter, the vibration, the feeling of the airframe starting to come apart. It never came. The Spitfire was rock solid. The controls stayed responsive. The wings, those supposedly fragile elliptical wings, didn't flex, didn't shake, didn't do anything except exactly what they were designed to do. Lambert pulled out of the dive and immediately pulled into a vertical climb. The Spitfire went straight up. He let it hang there for a moment, suspended against the blue English sky engine, howling, and then rolled over the top into a loop. The G-forces pressed him into the seat, but the aircraft never complained, never shuddered, never hesitated. When Lambert landed 20 minutes later, his crew chief was waiting on the tarmac. "Well?" Lambert climbed out of the cockpit slowly, took off his flight cap, ran a hand through his hair. "Those wings," he said quietly. "They're not fragile at all, are they?" The crew chief grinned. "No, sir, they are not." The American pilots weren't stupid. Once they actually flew the Spitfire, the skepticism evaporated fast. Within days, Lambert and the other Americans rotating through RAF squadrons were competing for flight time. The Spitfire became the most sought-after aircraft on the base. Because it wasn't just that the wings were strong, it was what those wings let the aircraft do. The elliptical design created a lift distribution that was nearly perfect across the entire span. That meant the Spitfire could pull tighter turns at lower speeds without stalling. It meant the roll rate was phenomenal. You could flip the aircraft onto its back almost instantly. It meant the climb performance was jaw-dropping. But more than that, it felt alive. American fighters were machines. Good machines, reliable machines, but machines. You flew them. You controlled them. They did what you told them to do, more or less. The Spitfire felt like a partner. One American pilot described it as dancing with someone who knows all the steps. Another said it was like the aircraft could read your mind. It wasn't just responsive, it was intuitive. The controls were harmonized so perfectly that the aircraft seemed to anticipate what you wanted. And in combat, that made all the difference. Lambert's first real engagement came 3 days after his initial flight. A scramble. Luftwaffe bombers inbound over the channel escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Lambert's flight launched with 8 Spitfires climbing hard to intercept. He'd been in combat before, flown training missions, but this was different. This was real. At 18,000 feet, they made contact. The Bf-109s came in fast, diving out of the sun. Classic German tactics. Lambert's squadron leader called the break, and the Spitfires scattered into defensive turns. Lambert yanked the stick hard left, and the Spitfire responded instantly, rolling into a turn so tight his vision started to gray at the edges. A 109 flashed past overshooting. Lambert reversed the Spitfire, snapping onto the German fighter's tail like it was magnetized. He squeezed the trigger. The 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing, opened up with a sound like tearing canvas. Tracers reached out, walked across the 109's fuselage. Smoke. The German fighter peeled away, streaming black exhaust, diving for the clouds. Lambert didn't follow. His squadron leader had drilled it into them, never follow a 109 into a dive. They're faster straight down. Instead, Lambert pulled up and around, scanning for threats. Another 109 was behind him. He saw the muzzle flashes, felt the Spitfire shudder as rounds snapped past some hitting. He didn't think, just reacted. Hard right. The Spitfire rolled and turned, the horizon spinning, and suddenly the German pilot was pulling lead instead of firing at a stationary target. The 109 tried to follow. It couldn't. The Spitfire's turn was too tight, too fast. The German fighter wallowed through the turn, losing speed, losing position. Lambert eased off, let the Spitfire slide into a climbing turn that the 109 couldn't match. 3 seconds later, he was above and behind the German. One burst, the 109's canopy shattered. The fighter nosed over and went down, trailing smoke. Lambert's heart was hammering. His hands were shaking. But the Spitfire was steady, calm, like nothing had happened. Back on the ground, Lambert's crew chief found bullet holes in the port wing. 3 of them, clean through and through. One had clipped a rib, another had torn through the wing's fabric-covered aileron. The wing was fine. The aileron still worked. The structure hadn't failed. Lambert stood there staring at the damage, thinking about what would have happened if those rounds had hit a less robust design. A wing that was actually as fragile as it looked. Paper-thin wings, his crew chief said, echoing Lambert's earlier words. But now he was smiling. "I was wrong," Lambert said quietly. "Yes, sir, you were." The Spitfire's reputation wasn't built overnight. It started in 1940 over Dunkirk and the beaches of France. RAF pilots flying. Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Hurricane did most of the heavy lifting in sheer numbers, but the Spitfire captured imaginations held off the Luftwaffe long enough for the evacuation to succeed. Then came the Battle of Britain. From July to October 1940, the Luftwaffe threw everything at England. Bombers by the hundreds, fighters by the dozens, wave after wave trying to pound the RAF into submission. The Spitfire met them head-on. It couldn't quite match the Bf-109 in speed or dive performance. The German fighter had a fuel-injected engine that didn't cut out in negative G maneuvers. It could dive away and climb back up with impunity. But the Spitfire could turn tighter, climb faster, and in the hands of a skilled pilot it was absolutely lethal. RAF pilots developed tactics that played to the Spitfire's strengths. Tight defensive turns that forced the 109s to overshoot, climbing spirals that left German fighters wallowing below. The Spitfire became the defensive fighter, the one that protected the Hurricane bombers and kept the 109s honest. By the end of the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was a legend. And the Americans watching from across the Atlantic still weren't sure they believed it. It took combat to convince them. Not tales, not statistics, not British propaganda films showing Spitfires gracefully looping through the sky. It took American pilots climbing into Spitfire cockpits, taking them into combat, and discovering firsthand that everything they'd been told was true. The 334th Fighter Squadron. One of the famous Eagle squadrons composed of American volunteers flying with the RAF, flew Spitfires almost exclusively. They racked up kills and learned lessons the hard way. One pilot, a farm kid from Iowa named James Goodson, wrote home about his first engagement in a Spitfire. His letter was blunt. "I thought the Brits were exaggerating. They weren't. This thing can outturn anything in the sky. I watched a 109 pilot try to follow me through a turn and he just couldn't. He gave up and dove away. That's never happened to me before. Ever." Another pilot describing a dogfight over France in late 1942 said it more poetically. "Fighting in a Spitfire is like dancing with someone who never steps on your toes. The plane goes where you think before you even move the stick. It's not just a machine, it's a partner." By 1943, the Americans were designing their own fighters with lessons learned from the Spitfire. The P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest American fighter of the war, borrowed heavily from Spitfire design philosophy. Laminar flow wings, clean aerodynamics, a focus on maneuverability and efficiency, not just brute strength. But even the Mustang pilots admitted the Spitfire had something special. Chuck Yeager, who flew, both said it best. The Mustang was faster and had better range, but the Spitfire could dance. The thing about those elliptical wings, the thing American pilots eventually learned, wasn't just that they were strong. It was that they were efficient. Every part of that wing contributed. There were no wasted sections, no dead spots. The lift distribution was nearly perfect, which meant every square inch of wing surface was working at optimal efficiency. That's why the Spitfire could turn so tight. That's why it could climb so fast. That's why it felt so responsive. Engineers called it span loading. Pilots called it magic. But it came at a cost. Those wings were expensive to build, time-consuming. Each one required skilled workers and precision manufacturing. Early in the war, when Britain was desperate for fighters, there was talk of simplifying the design, making the wings straight, easier to produce. The pilots revolted. Literally. RAF squadron leaders sent letters to the Air Ministry threatening to quit if the Spitfire's wings were changed. One letter written by a squadron commander named Douglas Bader, a double amputee who flew with prosthetic legs and was one of the RAF's top aces, was particularly blunt. The wings stayed elliptical. Lambert flew Spitfires for another year before transitioning to P-47 Thunderbolts when American squadrons finally got their own aircraft. The Thunderbolt was everything the Spitfire wasn't. Big, heavy, built like a tank. It could take ridiculous amounts of damage and keep flying. It had 8 50 caliber machine guns that could shred anything they touched. It was an incredible aircraft. But Lambert missed the Spitfire. He missed the way it turned, the way it climbed, the way it felt like an extension of his own thoughts. The Thunderbolt was powerful. The Spitfire was graceful. In his logbook, he wrote a single line after his last Spitfire flight. "I doubted you. I was a fool." The Spitfire fought in every theater of World War II. Over Malta, where a handful of Spitfires held off the entire Italian Air Force and kept the island from falling. Over North Africa, where desert-modified Spitfires dueled with German fighters in the scorching heat. Over Burma, where Spitfires clashed with Japanese Zeros in brutal dogfights over the jungle. And over Europe, where they escorted bombers, strafed ground targets, and dueled with the latest German fighters right up to the end of the war. By 1945, newer versions, the Griffin-engine Spitfire Mark 13s, could reach 450 miles per hour and climb to 40,000 feet. They were fast enough to intercept V-1 flying bombs, powerful enough to tangle with Germany's jet fighters. But they still had those elliptical wings, still had that grace. There's a moment in 1944 that encapsulates everything. An American pilot named John Godfrey, by then an ace with multiple kills, was asked by a war correspondent what he thought of the Spitfire compared to American fighters. Godfrey had flown P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. He knew American iron inside and out. He paused, thought about it, and then he said, "The American fighters are like driving a Cadillac, smooth, powerful, reliable. You get in and you know exactly what you're getting." He paused again. "The Spitfire is like dancing with Ginger Rogers. It makes you better than you actually are." The correspondent asked him to explain. "In an American fighter, you're the one doing the work. You're making it happen. In a Spitfire, it's a partnership. The plane wants to fly, wants to turn, wants to fight. You're just along for the ride, guiding it." He smiled. "And those wings we thought were fragile, turns out they're stronger than we ever were." The last Spitfires were retired from frontline service in the 1950s. Some went to museums. Some were scrapped. A few still fly today, maintained by collectors and aviation enthusiasts who keep the old machines alive. And when they fly, when you see a Spitfire roll and turn and climb through the sky, you understand why the pilots fell in love with them. Because those elliptical wings don't just cut through the air. They dance. There's a reunion photograph from 1987. A group of former Eagle Squadron pilots gathered at an air show in England. They're old now. Gray hair, wrinkled faces, some using canes, some in wheelchairs. Behind them on the tarmac sits a restored Spitfire Mark V. And in the photograph, every single one of them is smiling. Not the polite smile you give for a camera. The real kind. The kind that comes from seeing something you loved, something you thought you'd never see again. One of them, a pilot who'd flown over 60 combat missions in Spitfires, was asked what he was thinking about when the photo was taken. He said, "I was thinking about the first time I saw those wings and thought they'd never hold up. About how stupid I felt 3 days later. About how that stupid, fragile little airplane saved my life more times than I can count." He paused. "And I was thinking, I'd give anything to fly her one more time." The American pilots who mocked the Spitfire's wings learned a lesson that went beyond aerodynamics. They learned that beauty and strength aren't opposites, that elegance can be efficient, that something can look fragile and be anything but. They learned that the British, for all their tea and stiff upper lips, knew a thing or two about building fighters. And they learned to trust. Not just the aircraft, but the engineers who designed it, the workers who built it, the pilots who flew it into combat and came back alive because those fragile wings held together when everything else was falling apart. The Spitfire never had the range of the P-51, never had the ruggedness of the P-47, never had the raw power of the later American fighters. But it had something else. It had grace under fire. It had precision in chaos. It had those elliptical wings that American pilots doubted right up until the moment they didn't. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. Reginald Mitchell died before the Battle of Britain, before the Eagle squadrons, before American pilots would climb into his creation and discover that everything they'd been told was true. He never knew that his design would become one of the most beloved fighters in history, that pilots decades later would still speak about the Spitfire with reverence, that those controversial elliptical wings would become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in aviation. But maybe somewhere he knew anyway. Because engineers like Mitchell don't design for recognition, they design for performance, for efficiency, for that perfect balance between form and function. They design for the pilots who'll trust their lives to the machine. And the Spitfire, for all its grace and beauty and controversial design, choices never betrayed that trust. Not once. In 2015, a 92-year-old veteran named Robert Bob Morris stood in front of a Spitfire at the Imperial War Museum in London. He'd flown them during the war. 43 combat missions. 2 kills. 1 forced landing after taking flak over France. A young museum visitor asked him what it was like. Morris was quiet for a long moment, just stood there looking at the aircraft, at those elliptical wings, at the clean lines and the graceful curves. Finally, he spoke. "We thought they were too pretty to be fighters, too delicate. We were wrong about a lot of things back then." He reached out, touched the wing, Just his fingertips, gently, like greeting an old friend. This saved my life. These wings, this machine. I'm only here because someone designed this thing to be perfect. He was crying, just a little. 92 years old, and still crying over an airplane. "It was perfect," he said quietly, "and we almost didn't believe it." The American pilots who mocked the Spitfire learned their lesson quickly. Some in training flights, some in combat. All of them eventually. And for the rest of their lives, when someone asked them about the war, about the fighters they'd flown, about the machines that carried them through the most dangerous skies in history, they'd pause, think, and almost always they'd talk about the Spitfire. About those fragile wings that weren't fragile at all. About the fighter that could outturn everything in the sky. About learning to trust something that looked too beautiful to be real. And they'd smile, because they'd learned something important. Sometimes the most delicate-looking things are the strongest. Sometimes grace beats brute force. And sometimes those thin, elliptical wings you doubted. Those are exactly the wings that'll bring you home.